Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming out on a blustery Wheaton evening. I'd like to introduce myself to you if you are new to the community. I'm David Iglesias. I'm the director of the Wheaton Center for Faith, Politics, and Economics, and it's my distinct honor to introduce Dr. Seth Norton, who will be moderating this evening's event. Dr. Norton is professor of business and economics here at Wheaton. He served previously as director of the Wheaton Center for Faith, Politics, and Economics and had a key role in its creation. Dr. Norton holds a BA in history from Northwestern, an MA in public policy from the University of Wisconsin, an MBA in finance and industrial relations, and a PhD from the University of Chicago. He's previously taught at Triton College, Washington University, Illinois State, and the University of Michigan. And in addition to his academic duties, he was the head wrestling coach here at Wheaton between 1996 and 2008. So he can tie you up in logic and he can tie you up physically. So it's a pleasure to introduce moderator, my friend and colleague, Dr. Seth Norton.
Thank you, David, and I would like to say welcome as well to an evening where we are discussing income inequality, the role of markets and government. We have three distinguished speakers tonight. First is Sam Peltzman. Sam is Ralph and Dorothy Keller, Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Economics at the University of Chicago. Sam is one of the world's most distinguished economists by many standards, specializing, although he doesn't specialize that much, actually writing in numerous domains, but examining the role of government regulation in the economy, the growth of government, automobile safety, drug innovation, or more precisely, lack of drug innovation, the political economy of public education, the economics of voting, the internet. He has a wide record. He has been editor of the prestigious Journal of Political Economy for multiple decades. He also is currently editor of the Journal of Law and Economics, as well as director emeritus of the George J. Stigler Center for the Study of the Economy and State at the University of Chicago. We are delighted to have Sam here. Our other participants are equally well suited for this event. Bruce Meyer is McCormick Foundation professor at the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago. Professor Meyer is doing studying this topic that we are addressing tonight, dealing with issues of the measurement of equality, trends in inequality, the trends in inequality related to the Great Recession and the economic downturn of 2007-2008, as well as specific issues such as Medicaid policy, disability policy. He will be talking about those tonight. Our third presenter is Professor Brad Wilcox, professor of sociology and director of the Family National Marriage Project at the University of Virginia. Professor Wilcox is a distinguished student of the family. He has published widely, as has Professor Meyer, in numerous domains. He has published in the leading journals in sociology, American Sociological Review, Social Forces, the Journal of Scientific Study of Religion. He is also an active publisher in popular literature for elite magazines and elite newspapers, so he's worn several areas. He will be our third speaker tonight. He is an expert in the link, you might say the nexus, between public policy and culture as it relates to the family and the perverse effects in that domain. So we are going to deal with some issues tonight. Let me list you some big questions that we are going to address. What's the difference between poverty and inequality? Does the law of unintended effect apply to government policy aimed at poverty or inequality reduction? And do strong families prevent poverty and inequality or reduce poverty and inequality? Those are three big questions we will raise. You will see then in the presentations that follow. We are going to start, though, without not addressing those questions directly, but we're going to talk about the context of poverty, the context of inequality. It is a big issue politically. It is as important issue domestically, politically, as anything else. So we will start that. We will go in order that I presented them, Professor Peltzman, Professor Meyer, and Professor Wilcox. After that, we will have a panel discussion with them with several questions that I've delineated and passed to them and will bring up as in the wake of their separate presentations. Later in the evening, we'll give you an opportunity to ask questions. We have cards and pencils in the hymn book folders in the front seat in front of you. If you look at those, you can ask a question. You can ask a question of these particular participants or to all of them about the issues that we're dealing with tonight. So without further ado, let's start with Professor Peltzman, giving us the context of poverty and inequality.
You have that, thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for coming. And after that extremely generous introduction, maybe I should just stop. But I won't. I would like to take a few minutes to address three questions. The first one is, why are we here? The second one is, why are we here now? And the third is, what's going to happen in the future? Okay, so I'll start with the first one. Why are we here? That's in some sense the easiest question, although only in some sense. What is reasonably clear is that there's a large and growing gap between the rich and the poor. So here's a picture of that, and I'm going to basically limit myself to flying 10,000 feet up and giving you the basic facts. And this is the most basic fact, I think, that people often look at when they're talking about the subject of inequality. What you see here is the bottom 20% of households, let's call those the poor people, and the top 20% of households in terms of household income, let's call them the rich people. And this is just the ratio of the average income of the rich to the average income of the poor. And what you see is this is the full period over which the data are available in this particular form. It starts just before 1970. You see, the first 10 years, nothing much is happening. In the mid to late 1970s, a trend starts that continues to this day. Back at the beginning, the rich households had 10 times the average income as the poor households. Today it's 17, and it's been going up for a long time now. So that's why we're here. There's this very powerful trend. Now, there are important qualifications to this picture, and you're going to hear some later on. But these are the basic facts that we're going to contend with. Now, before I go on, let me say something about who the rich are and who the poor are. These are folks, they're not a very exclusive club, either one of them. They're folks you encounter every day. Rich people, on this definition, or rich households, I say people, but I'm really talking about households. They have an average income of $200,000 a year these days. To get into this club, you have to have at least $120,000. And that's, if you think about it, that's a two-earner household with two kind of college-educated salaries. I venture to say we have a lot of folks from rich households by this definition in this room. Who are the poor? Well, they have an average income of only $12,000 a year. And you graduate from this club if you have an average household income of $23,000, which is these are people you meet every day, but not as often in a community like this as you meet the rich people. Let me elaborate a little bit on this and show you what rich people and poor people look like before we go on, just so we're all on the same page and we understand what we mean by these terms. What am I doing here? It's wrong. There we go. Here's a picture. Let me explain what you're looking at. You see a very heavy line at 20. That means 20%. By definition, by my definition here, rich people and poor people, or rich households and poor households, are 20% of the population. So if you see something that's way above 20% or way below 20%, it means either over or underrepresented. So, for example, on your left, you can see that while poor households are by definition 20% of the population, a third of the households who are black are in the poor category. Blacks are overrepresented. So too are female-headed households, overrepresented among the poor, and both way underrepresented among the rich. And you can see the other categories. I would emphasize here the role of education. Look at the difference between high school dropouts, that's less than high school here, and college graduates. If the head of the household is a college graduate, there's less than a 10% chance that they're in the poor category, and a 40%, almost 40% chance that they're in the rich category. That is, their representation is way under half at the low end and way about twice at the upper end. Contrast that with high school dropouts where the reverse is true. Education's very important. We can talk about family structure later, which is one of the questions that's on the agenda. So you can see that poor households tend to be black, high school dropouts, don't work, that's the middle category. I'm not going to go through all of these. And they, of course, they overlap to some extent. Okay, so the first point that I've been making is it's obvious that inequality has been growing. I want to get to the second question, but that's why are we here now? It's not enough to say that inequality has been growing. It's been growing for 30 plus years now, and the process was glacial. There was no sudden, well, you're not talking about some sudden development that shifted income away from the poor and toward the rich. In fact, the opposite is true. Over short periods of time, the rich and the poor are in the same boat, right? So here's an illustration of that. On the vertical axis here, you see year-to-year growth and household income for the poor. Okay, that's the lowest quintile. On the horizontal axis, you see year-to-year growth of the rich, and you see that generally they move up together. Basically, a good year for the rich is also a good year for the poor, and vice versa. This has nothing to do with trickle down or trickle up. It's just a fact. Any good year is good for both. It's just that over time, the good years are a bit better for the rich, and the bad years are a bit worse for the poor, and it compounds over time to that rising trend of the difference between the two. But don't think of this as the poor are losing and the rich are gaining. It's a much more glacial, steady kind of progress. And in any short period of time, the two are in the same boat. I think it's for this reason that until recently, very recently, inequality was a much bigger issue among academics and academic hangers-on than it was for real people. So it really is an important question to ask, what's changed recently to make inequality a big political issue, as it was in the presidential campaign last year? Now, my answer is one word: growth. It helps to understand why I'm going to emphasize growth from here on, to get behind these gross kind of numbers and see how the rich and poor have fared over time, in particular this kind of picture. What's happened over this whole period in somewhat greater detail. So here is that picture, and here again, what you're looking at are the rich and the poor. The poor are in blue and the rich are in red. And this is their average growth in household income by decade. Okay, not year to year, but by decade. As far back as these numbers let us go. So we start in 1968 and then go every 10 years. Except the last, we don't have 16 and 17 for the last period. And the picture is quite stark if you look at it. Since the 1970s, as we have seen already, income has grown faster for the rich than the poor. But, and I think this is what's really important, it has grown for both groups until the very last period. Until that period, these poor households who are in blue are above zero in every decade. It means that they could at least see some improvement in their condition. And again, I want to caution, these numbers that you see probably understate to some degree, and you'll hear why later on, what the reality is for both of these groups. But in the last period, there's a visible deterioration, especially among the poor, who go below zero in a meaningful way over a long period of time. And that's the reason I submit that the issue has become salient politically now. It's not inequality per se, which as I say, is not very interesting outside academic circles. But it's that large chunks of our population are moving backwards. And note, the rich haven't been doing so hot either in the last couple of periods. Their growth has decelerated from about 1.5% a year to maybe 0.5%. But it's still growth. And we're overall, as a society, we are in a no growth or a very slow growth environment where the rich are getting richer slowly and the poor are moving now backwards. And we're all fighting over the scraps. This is a politically toxic environment, and the toxicity has bubbled to the surface. And it's unlikely to go away without more economic growth. Now, instead of telling you how we might get more growth, I want to just stick to the facts and deal with the question of what's behind this great slowdown here in growth that's pushed substantial numbers of households into negative territory in terms of growth. Now, at some level, this is not, it sounds like a very ambitious question to ask, why is growth slow? But at some level, it's not rocket science. You can get growth in household income basically in some combination of three ways. You can either have more resources per worker, that is to say savings, capital accumulation, and the like, or you can have better skills and technology in deploying the resources that you have. You get more out of given resources, or at the household level, you can have more people working per household. On every one of these dimensions, the last period here has been a disaster. To quote a politician, likes to use that term, it's been a disaster. Let me walk through these dimensions. Okay, so here you have this again. It's more complicated than it really looks. More complicated than it really is. The green bars here are total factor productivity. That's the skills and technology part of the story. How much are we getting out of a given amount of resources in terms of growth? Okay, and you can see the answer to that is, about 1.5% here, 0.5% here. It's averaging something like 1% a year until the last period where it goes below 0.5% per year. It's the worst decade so far for total factor productivity since this period that I'm focusing on begins. Okay? What about resources per worker? That's the capital, the savings, the investment part of the story. That's the red bar. And you can see that's been growing until the last period, where it's half or less of its average over the previous 4 decades. Okay. So those two are feeding into the lowest increase in output per worker of the period. That's the blue bar. You can see that's now also mathematically it has to be if total factor productivity and capital per hour are both growing at the slowest rate that we have over this period, so too will output per hour. On top of that, we're not working as much. That's the third way you can get more household income growth. Here is labor force participation, the fraction of all adults who are working. Now you see what was happening over this period is cyclical increase. This is women coming into the labor force big time, okay, until this last period where it just falls off a cliff. So that avenue of growth is at a historic, it's not at a historic low level, but it's plummeted in just the last period. Now, an economist should tell you that markets have two sides. So what's going on here is reflecting a couple of things. It's workers dropping out and discouraged from looking for work, and it's employers less willing to hire. So the title of this panel is about inequality, but I'm going to tell you that the real issue is growth. And I'm going to conclude with some simple arithmetic. As I said, this is not rocket science. The only way that this politically toxic fighting over scraps in a no-growth kind of environment is going to reverse is some combination of a few things, three things in particular. The discouragement to working and hiring has to dissipate. Whatever is discouraging savings and investing has to dissipate. And the skills of the workforce and the technology that they have to work with has to get upgraded. It's a tough menu, but it beats fighting over scraps. And I'm going to conclude with two numbers. It is very appropriate for us to be having this session on the eve of the inauguration of a new administration. And I will offer you and the new administration two numbers, 3 and 2. Okay? If we grow at 3% a year or better in the next 4 years, this administration will be reelected. If we grow at 2% or less, which is what we've been having in the last decade or so, this administration will not be reelected, and these problems will not get better. It is as simple as that. And thank you for your indulgence.
Thanks. I'm Bruce Meyer. I'm very happy to be here, and I hope to get a chance to meet a lot of the new faces here. I won't be able to shake your hand because I have a bad cold, and hopefully it won't slow me down too much tonight. I'm also very happy to see at least a few old faces to me. One of your distinguished faculty members here, Jason Long, I had the pleasure of teaching when we were both at Northwestern many years ago. So I am going to say some things that I expect will upset or please people on the left and the right. I'm not sure whether I'm going to make everyone happy or unhappy because I'll have something for everyone to like and dislike. My views are going to be a little bit more favorable than Sam's, a little bit more upbeat. Let me say that if you look at newspapers or you listen to what politicians have to say today, You'll hear a lot about inequality and that it's gone up and that it's bad. And inequality usually refers to inequality in income, and usually there's a focus on people at the very top. I'm going to argue that this conventional reporting really overstates the extent of inequality and its rise, that you don't want to focus so much on the very top, and you don't want to focus on income measures of inequality because income is poorly reported in surveys. One of my colleagues works on surveys of sexual behavior. And if you look at his numbers, you'll see that people are much more willing to tell you about their intimate sexual lives than tell you about their income. That's reflected in the quality of the data on income that we get from surveys. If you look at consumption inequality, the level of inequality is much lower, and it shows a decline over time. So this is a figure from work with co-author Jim Sullivan at Notre Dame. And what I'm showing you here is the ratio of income at the 90th percentile compared to the 10th. That's the top line here that's generally going up. And so that's the kind of thing that people are emphasizing. The lower figures, or the lower lines, are measures of consumption inequality, what people are able to spend on food and housing and transportation and other things. And you'll see that those measures are going generally downward, okay? And that's especially true in the last 10 or 15 years, where their directions really sharply diverge. Here's another figure that focuses on the bottom half of the distribution. And here, instead of comparing the 90th percentile of income or consumption to the 10th, I'm comparing the 50th to the 10th. And again, for income at the top, you see that it's gone up over time. But with consumption, there's more clearly a downward trend in the ratio of the 50th to the 10th. And that's because consumption inequality, especially at the bottom, has fallen quite a bit over time. Now, what I'm not showing you here is that I'm not showing you the very top percentiles. And clearly, inequality at the very top has gone up a lot. And if you looked at the top half of the distribution in terms of consumption inequality, that's gone up a little bit over time, but not a lot. But if you look at the bottom half or the bulk of the distribution, you don't see much increase in inequality. And if you look at the bottom half of consumption, you see a decline in inequality. Now, this focus on inequality, I think, is also misplaced. We have a principle in economics called the Pareto principle, which says that you should be happy if everybody does at least as well, even if some people do better, okay? So that's not that different from arguing that thou shalt not covet. You know, it's the 10th commandment, but still important, maybe more important than some of the others. And so I'd argue that it's not a good idea to build envy into public policy, and we shouldn't make reducing incomes at the top a goal in itself. So if focusing on inequality at the very top is overstated, what is more important? I'd argue that worrying about how people at the bottom are doing, so worrying about the share of people in moderate or extreme deprivation, i.e. in poverty. That's something that I think we really should focus on. Also, I'd argue more important is the circumstances of the bulk of the population, the conditions of the middle class. And if you look at tangible measures of how the poor or the middle class are doing, abstracting from income where there are a lot of difficulties in how to measure it and difficulties in how to adjust for changes in prices over time, I'm just going to show you some tangible measures of people's living conditions. Here I'm going to show you characteristics of the apartments and houses that people live in, but you could also do this for cars or look at the food people eat. And what this shows is that if you look at, and this is the middle 20% of the population in terms of income, if you look at the apartments or houses they live in terms of the number of rooms, the square footage, whether they have air conditioning, whether they have central air, the presence of major appliances like a dishwasher, clothes dryer, or washer, everything has gone up. The only negative numbers here, and you might focus on changes over the whole period that we look at here, or changes over the last 10 years. The only negative numbers here are declines in leaks in roofs or plumbing. So everything is getting better, and quite substantially over time. Okay? This is for the middle. You can do the same thing for the bottom 20%. And that's what we do here. And again, you see that the size of apartments people are living in, number of rooms, square footage, whether they have air conditioning, whether they have major appliances, all of that's getting better, and it's less likely they have a leaky roof or leaky plumbing. And if you look at ownership of cars and the characteristics of cars people are driving at the bottom or the top, well, this is the middle or the bottom, things are getting better. So why do official statistics get things wrong? Well, in the case of poverty, our official poverty measure says that poverty rate is the same as it was 35 years ago. Well, why does it get it wrong? Well, the income measure doesn't include in-kind transfers, so it doesn't include food stamps or SNAP or housing benefits or Medicaid. It also doesn't account for tax credits like the Earned Income Tax Credit. And these policies are some of the most important things we've done to reduce poverty over the last 20 or 30 years. Furthermore, cash transfers are underreported in these surveys. I've done work where we match what the government has paid out to what people report in the official surveys used to determine poverty. And you find that about half of people that are receiving cash welfare or food stamps, now called SNAP, don't report it. So it's just missed in the survey. And a third reason why these official measures understate people's well-being, overstate poverty, is that the cutoffs below which you're declared poor have moved up too fast over time because they're indexed to inflation in a way that overstates inflation. So what has been leading to this decline in poverty or improvement in standards of living if you look at better measures? Well, the main force has been economic growth over time, but there has been an important role for welfare and social insurance programs, particularly Social Security and the Earned Income Tax Credit. And conventional measures miss much of this improvement because these transfers from the government are very poorly reported in the surveys or not recorded at all. So let me talk a little bit about policy. Now, I would argue, and this may displease the conservatives here, that we still have the ability to raise taxes a bit at the top, and there are good reasons to not get rid of the inheritance tax. And in the case of income taxes, I would argue that the evidence says that we can raise taxes a little bit without diminishing effort too much. And in the case of the inheritance tax actually improves efficiency. It actually increases the pie. The best evidence that looks at the effect of receiving an inheritance finds that it tends to cause those receiving the inheritance to work less. They're less likely to start a business, less likely to hire more employees. And that's not surprising. If you get an inheritance, there's less impetus for you to go out and work hard. This was something that Carnegie argued 100 years ago. And Bill Gates has been making this case recently. Now, I've also been told that I should talk a little bit about the potential unintended effects of government policies. So let me talk briefly about unemployment insurance. One of the programs that does serve a valuable purpose of maintaining the living standards of people after a job loss. However, what this figure shows is that many people wait until their unemployment benefits are just about to run out to go out and find a job. So this is actually an old figure from my thesis, and so I'm quite fond of it, but it probably predates many of the undergrads, their birth here. And there's more recent evidence showing this more convincingly, but I was one of the first to really show that if you look at the rate of job finding and graph it in terms of how long people are away from when their benefits run out, their job finding suddenly increases when their benefits are about to disappear. Let me also show you another figure. And what this figure shows is that if you give people more generous unemployment insurance that lasts longer, and this is based on German data, they stay out of work longer when you give them benefits that last longer. So at these ages, unemployment benefits last a few more months, and at those same points where unemployment benefits last longer, people start spending more time out of work. And this study also looks at what happens to people's long-term earnings, and they find quite convincingly that longer unemployment benefits lead people to lose more skills and harms their long-term earnings. So I'm not telling you that we should get rid of unemployment insurance, but you want to realize that the policy has some negative consequences that you really need to balance against the positive effects of it in terms of shielding people's living standards when they lose a job and keeping the economy going when other people aren't spending. So let me finish by noting that Mark and Matthew and John quoted Jesus as saying that the poor shall always be with us, and he was in turn quoting Deuteronomy 15, where God says that we should always pay attention and help the poor. And I think that that's right, but I also want to tell you that the poor of today are nothing like the poor of 35 years ago, that we've made a lot of progress both because of growth of government, because of growth of the economy and because of government policies that have worked to reduce poverty. Let me also say that Deuteronomy 15, that same part of the Bible, is the absolute favorite part of the Bible for professors because it describes in detail sabbatical. And I am looking forward to a sabbatical next year.
Well, I'm also looking forward to a sabbatical next year. And I'm also going to touch, like our first speaker, on our presidents. And I'm going to mention President Obama for his last night as president. So economic inequality is the defining challenge of our time, President Barack Obama declared in a recent speech to the Center for American Progress. Inequality is dangerous, he argued, not merely because it's unseemly to have a large gap between the rich and the poor, but because inequality in and itself destroys upper mobility, making it harder for the poor to escape from poverty. Quote, increased inequality and decreasing mobility pose a fundamental threat to the American dream, he said. And in sort of making this argument, Obama was only the most, I think, prominent public figure to point to some major problems in the American economy, from inequality to poverty to declining rates of male labor force participation. And certainly there are some reasons for concern. I want to give you just kind of a sense of some of the factors that the president and others have been touching on in pointing to some weaknesses in the contemporary economic landscape. So first, again, just to kind of revisit some points that were made at the beginning by our first speaker, we can see there's been a pretty marked increase in family income inequality since the 1970s. We also can see, too, that this idea that the American dream is sort of fundamentally constitutive of our common life really isn't realized in the real world. What we see here from some data from Pew is when you look at kind of relative mobility, for instance, across the generations, what you see is that more than half of kids who are born and raised in poor families remain so into adulthood. So I think that's a pretty powerful indictment of the idea that it doesn't really matter kind of where you're born or how you're raised, and you've got a shot at sort of making America. Well, that really isn't true for a majority of kids who are born and raised in poor families in America. So again, this is kind of evidence here of economic immobility that is particularly problematic for the poor in America. And then a third point to be concerned about, and you can ignore this bottom little line that's I don't know where that came from, but the two big lines I want to sort of point out up at the top here are charting declining labor force participation for men. And you can see that this pattern is more pronounced for men along that red line. It's men who don't have college degrees. And so one reason we are seeing more economic inequality characterizing our country, and we're also seeing immobility too, among the poor is that not enough men are in the labor force, not enough men are working full-time today compared to, earlier years, as this slide here suggests. So clearly, the three slides that I've just presented to you kind of give you a sense of some of the economic problems facing our country. But really do sort of public conversations about things like inequality, things like poverty, things like declining male labor force participation, which have gotten a lot of play in the Obama White House, have gotten a lot of play in the New York Times, have gotten a lot of play in the Academy. Really do they focus on the question of family structure in all this? I think this is a major oversight. Although I think few realize it, the retreat from marriage in our country has played a central role in the changing economic landscape of American families, particularly because the retreat from marriage, and by which I mean increases in divorce, increases in single parenthood, increases in family instability, declines in marriage, has really been concentrated in recent years among less educated Americans, among the poor, and among the working class. So what we're kind of seeing in the family world is an increasingly separate and unequal world, where college-educated Americans manage to basically get and stay married today, and their less educated and less affluent peers are more likely to experience family instability and single parenthood. And this sort of diverging family pattern is helping to fuel some of the economic things that we've been concerned about in our public conversation. So if we take, for instance, first, family income inequality, work that I've done with Bob Lerman at the Urban Institute, work that Bruce Western has done at Harvard, suggests that a significant share of growing family income inequality can be tied to shifts in American family, to the growth of single parenthood, which has been, again, concentrated among the least affluent or among the poorest Americans in ways that increase this divide between not just the rich and the poor, but between kind of the upper middle class and the working class and the poor. So again, my point is that the family change has been one factor driving inequality here in the US. It's also the case, too, that it looks like both at kind of the individual level and even the community level that there is a connection between mobility or the health of the American dream and the health of the family. And here, just to kind of touch on the sort of the ecological story or the environmental story here, we've seen work done by Raj Chetty and his colleagues. Raj was at Harvard, now he's at Stanford, is that they've found that there's a strong tie between the share of single parents in a community and the odds that kids will experience, poor kids will experience mobility over the course of their adult lives. And so poor kids who are being raised in communities with lots of two-parent families are more likely to move up the economic ladder into adulthood. By contrast, poor kids who are being raised in communities with lots of single parents are more likely to remain poor as they move into adulthood. And Chetty finds that family structure is one of 5 key factors that does a very good job of predicting whether or not poor kids will experience mobility, will kind of realize the American dream as they move into adulthood. And I should also just note, I've got a picture there of Salt Lake City. And that's there because if you look at the big metro areas in the country, one of the metro areas that does the best in fostering mobility for poor kids, that is kind of propelling them into the upper quintile as adults, is family structure. And Salt Lake City has a high share of two-parent families compared to many other metro areas in the U.S. So it does a pretty good job on the mobility front compared to, say, Atlanta or Charlotte or other metro areas. And then finally, we turn to this issue of declines in men's labor force participation. We can see, just from a kind of a descriptive perspective, that these declines have been larger for men who are not married and not living with kids. That's the group at the bottom of this slide. And they've been less consequential for men who are married with kids. And when Bob Lerman and I kind of looked at this in a more sophisticated multivariate context, we found that about 1/3 of the decline in men's labor force participation since the 70s can be attributed to shifts in family structure. That is, that fewer and fewer men are living in a married family, and that has sort of an impact on their willingness, their dedication, their commitment to pursuing work. So just to kind of wrap up here, I want to reflect on why it is that I think that marriage and family life have been important, economically speaking, for families in contemporary America. And I'm just going to make 3 quick points that kind of connect or help to explain or unpack these 3 slides. So I think one reason that sort of family structure and marriage matter for economics is that marriage is conducive to more stable long-term unions. And that means that married families are more likely to pool their incomes, to benefit from economies of scale, and to avoid the economic challenges that are associated with supporting kids across multiple households. And of course, unfortunately, as we know, working class and poor Americans are less likely to benefit from those economic features of married family life today. A second point to make is that kids who have married parents are more likely to benefit from the time, the attention, the advice, and the emotional support of 2 adults compared to kids who don't have married parents. So we know that kids from married homes are more likely to do well in school, more likely to graduate from college, more likely to avoid incarceration, more likely to avoid teen pregnancy. And then as they move into the labor force, they're more likely to be gainfully employed and earning more money as younger adults. So the second point then is that kids who are coming from stable 2-parent families are more likely to be flourishing in today's economy. And unfortunately, of course, kids from working class and poor households are less likely to benefit today from a 2-parent married family. And the third point I want to make is that a lesser known, I think, economic advantage of marriage relates to its impact on men. And the economist George Akerlof, who is a Nobel laureate and the husband to our current Fed chair Janet Yellen, has observed that, quote, men settle down when they get married. If they fail to get married, they fail to settle down. Now, that comment seems a bit archaic and a bit out of touch today, but it still is fundamentally true based upon a lot of different research that men tend to work harder, smarter, and more successfully when they get and stay married. Their work hours, for instance, increase around the time that they get married. If they get divorced, their work hours tend to decline. They're less likely to be fired, for instance, than their roughly equivalent peers who are not married. So there are a variety of ways in which, again, marriage is kind of helping to connect men to labor force. And unfortunately, of course, as fewer and fewer working class and poor men are married, they don't have that kind of family incentive to engage labor force. And that kind of reinforces some of these trends we've been talking about this evening. So given the many ways that strong and stable families redound to the benefit of adults, kids, and the larger commonweal, we should be thinking about ways to revive the fortunes of marriage in this century. This means pursuing public policies that eliminate marriage penalties and many of our means-tested policies. It means thinking about education reforms that do a better job of equipping young men who are not on the college track with vocational skills that will make them better breadwinners. It means thinking about cultural renewal that seeks to reconnect marriage and parenthood for all Americans. And it also means, I think, that we should be strengthening efforts on the religious side to focus on family life, and particularly in working class and poor communities. And the alternative to taking policy, cultural, and civic steps like the ones I've just mentioned is to accept a country where kind of a separate and unequal family regime is the order of the day. That is, where the highly educated and the affluent enjoy strong and stable households, and everyone else is consigned to increasingly unstable, unhappy, and unworkable ones. And that alternative, I hope we can all agree tonight, is un-American and unacceptable. So, thank you.
I think I learned a lot. What we are going to do now is have a period of questions and answers where you can ask our distinguished guests a question. You can ask a particular guest if they covered a topic that you find of interest, or you can ask the collective group. In front of you in the book racks, there are cards and there are pencils there. If you can start filling those out, we'll take a few minutes for you to do that. In the meantime, I will ask Sam a question. So you can start doing that as you so desire. So Sam, among other things, you've done some work on public education in the United States. Can public education be reformed to reduce inequality in the U.S.? And perhaps you could imagine in that format, can public education in the city of Chicago, where you've lived for many years? So that's a quick question, but I wonder, while the audience is working on their questions and answers, if you could address that.
Well, I'm a congenital optimist, so I should say yes. More important, I think it had better be reformed. Well, one of the real problems we have, and I mean it's cut through, particularly the last speaker and some of the data that I showed before, is the role of human capital that means education for present purposes, in alleviating some of the concerns that we've had. It's just a huge, if you talk about a first-order problem for policy generally in this country, this would be very close to the top of the list. So I think it has to be reformed. Now, which way you go and do that, we all have answers. I have some of my own, but I'm reasonably optimistic that we're gradually moving in the right direction. But we better be moving in that direction, or we're going to remain in trouble. One of the first order reasons why you're seeing this growing gap is that the market is placing a higher premium on acquiring human capital, and anybody who drops out before graduating high school, at least, as you saw, has a hugely increased chance of being in the bottom 20%, and these days of moving backwards rather than forwards. So I'm optimistic, but it's a big issue. It's a really first-order issue.
I'm optimistic too, because I was born a Cub fan, and what more can you say? Let me switch to Bruce for a second here. And that is, I looked at that last graph you had up, and I looked at some of the sentiment between what you produced and what Sam produced, and I'm wondering, can I understand the difference between what Sam produced a little bit and what you produced, and the similarity with that last graph? Let me ask you, is there a crisis in the social safety net with respect to unemployment compensation, disability, some of the things you mentioned?
Well, I don't know if I'd say there's a crisis, but I will say one thing that I struggle with is how to explain why people are unhappy, it seems, even though I'm arguing that things are getting better for most people. And I think part of the story is that just there are things that catch on in terms of what people are talking about and people are thinking about. And if you look at what period was the worst in terms of growth before the recent years on SAM's figures. It's the late 70s, early 80s. And that's also the worst time in terms of increases in inequality, whether you look at consumption or income. If you look at wages, that's true also. But there wasn't so much discussion of these issues back then. So I think part of it is it's just what catches on. But there are real things, real forces that I think are affecting why people are upset now. And I think that people, even though their incomes may be raised by government programs, even though their consumption may be maintained by disability benefits, say in West Virginia, where disability receipt rates are really high, I think probably people don't really like being on those benefits and don't like not having a job. And, you know, one of the real puzzles of the election is why, say, people in West Virginia, where, as I said, you have really high rates of disability receipt, voted essentially against government programs, because they're voting essentially against what is supporting them. And I think part of the story is that people don't like not having a job. They don't like getting these benefits. I suspect there where a lot of men aren't working, the men don't like the fact that they're not working. The women don't like the fact that they're working and supporting their husbands. So it's,
Yes.
I think that the problems are more complicated than you would get just by, you would think just by looking at income or consumption, that you do really need to look at work as well.
Thank you. I have one for Brad as well. This one's a little tougher. It's not my turf, but here's how I interpret things. Pope John and Pope Benedict, and the man for whom this building is named, affirmed evangelism. Here's a stretch. This is a hypothetical, Brad, and I didn't tell you this first, but I've been thinking about it. If there is such a thing as effective evangelism, would that strengthen the family and reduce inequality?
I think the short answer to your question is yes, but it would have to be, and this is sort of hinted at in my closing comments, kind of evangelism that was really targeting working class and poor Americans. And so to build on Bruce's comments, I think one of the issues that we're seeing in the working class and the poor is not just issues related to sort of consumption or income growth. It's really a more sociological point, and that is that there's been a great kind of disconnect happening with fundamental American institutions, work, marriage, religion, for instance. And we've seen in the last 35 years dramatic declines in church attendance among Americans who don't have a college degree. And that, I think, has implications for their emotional well-being, their sense of meaning, solidarity, but even, I think, probably their capacity to engage in meaningful work and things like that. So I think at some level, it would help to address some of the cultural and behavioral challenges that are now confronting working class and poor Americans in ways that would improve their lot along a variety of indicators. So, yeah.
Thank you. I have a quick question for Dr. Peltzman. What is the relationship between domestic economic growth and economic globalization, and how can we apply this to income inequality? You've got 30 seconds.
my view is not different than, I would say, the center of the economics profession in these matters. I think they're basically complementary in the long run. Obviously, global competition might be good for the whole society. There are going to be people left behind. And I think a major message is that we haven't taken that last clause seriously enough. If you're talking about tax policy or transfer policy, I would put a greater emphasis on dealing with that last clause, the people who are left behind, than I think we have done in the past. So the 30-second answer is it's good for most of us, and it's good in the long run for even more of us, but there are short run there are people who are adversely affected in the short run that I think we should and are going to take more seriously going forward.
Thank you. For Professor Wilcox, there seems to be a glaring absence in your research on the role of women and the role of women play in the workforce and home. How does this conversation change when you include women?
Well, when you include women in the conversation that I was talking about in terms of family structure and economics, I mean, one thing that you see is that girls and women who are raised in intact married families are more likely to flourish both in school and also in the labor force, particularly in their early 20s and early 20s, late 20s, and early 30s. But the reason I didn't sort of focus on women in my remarks this evening is that it still is the case, even today, that in sort of the average married family, that the husband tends to make more income. And so the fact that we've seen such a dramatic decline in men's connection to labor force, particularly in working class and poor communities, and more for them than the women in those communities, has been a much bigger force fueling family instability, again, especially in working class and poor communities. So that's why I focus more tonight on kind of the declining place of working class and poor men in today's economy.
This next question is directed towards Professor Meyer. You talked about focusing on those in poverty and the middle class, but also maintaining an inheritance tax. What are the effects that you anticipate from this tax?
Sure. I mentioned inheritance tax and income taxation without motivating why you might want to have those taxes and raise more revenue. And let me just start by mentioning that. And that's that to invest in infrastructure, to invest in human capital, as Sam mentioned, to maintain our defense. I think all of those things will need more revenue. And in terms of the inheritance tax, the way to think about it is it's one of the few taxes where when we raise taxes, we think it might have good effects in terms of increasing the economic pie. Because in order to think about that problem, you want to think about first people who are giving the inheritance. And if you tax inheritances, it's unclear whether taxing them will make them work harder or less hard. There are effects that go both ways. They may work less hard because now it will be harder for them to give an inheritance to their kids. But On the other hand, if they have in mind that they want to give a certain amount of an inheritance, they have to work harder to then achieve that. So it goes both ways. So it essentially has an ambiguous effect for the people that would be leaving the inheritance. On the other hand, for those who are receiving an inheritance, it's clear what the effect will be. That on average, it's got to reduce their effort to work, to start businesses, to innovate, because they have this income, they no longer need to support themselves. And that's a theoretical result, and a lot of empirical work has confirmed that. So overall, while people like to talk about the inheritance tax as the death tax, a brilliant marketing ploy to label it the death tax, it actually, among taxes, it's one that has good efficiency properties, and probably in increasing it probably would increase the size of the economic pie.
Another one for Dr. Wilcox. In your presentation, you focused on the importance of two-parent households and greater participation of men in the workforce. Does this suggest a focus on reducing the mass incarceration of young men could have some strong positive economic effects?
Yeah, I think it's definitely the case that criminal justice reform could be helpful in obviously in bringing men into the family and also into the labor force in ways that would be good both for family, marriage, and the economy more generally. So yes.
Thank you. For Professor Peltzman, is it quite possible that the data shown for the years targeting 2008 to 2015 could account for the 07-08 housing market crash? Could average annual growth in household income be normalized over the 08-15 time period and be an outlier?
That's a very good question. Some of it, yes, but not the degree to which things have collapsed over the period that I've showed. After all, the previous decade also started with a recession. The 80s started with a recession, as has actually been brought up already. What's different about this period is that the rebound has been much, much slower. And that's why it's cumulated to what I referred to as a disaster. We've had average total growth on the order of 2% or less. And that would not have happened if we had a typical rebound from the kind of recession that we had in 08 and 09. So it's a little bit of that, but that's not the story. It's worse.
Here's for anyone that wants it. Is cutting TANF or SNAP benefits more harmful than helpful?
That's a hard one. SNAP, it's a good question because SNAP, which is renamed food stamps, is now one of our biggest programs, and it's grown very dramatically over the last 15 years. So it's really a big part of the safety net these days. It's what is available to people who don't have some obvious condition that makes them needy. So it covers people, we have programs for those who are disabled. We have programs for single parents. We have programs for the aged. And, there's a more obvious case that those people are needy. SNAP is for anyone with low income that doesn't necessarily have a disability or children to support or is aged and unable to work. So it's really the bottom line for the rest of the poor. And there is some good evidence that shows that SNAP, when it was rolled out many years ago, led to a decline in infant mortality among the families on SNAP that had kids. So there is some evidence that it's done good things. It also is probably one of the reasons fewer people are working these days. But the evidence on that is a little bit, I think, more mixed.
Okay. For anyone, it appears that inequality is tied to the growing costs of higher education. Why are tuition bills so high, and how can we reduce them?
I think it's because you have a superb faculty that you have to keep in place. And you have to compete in the market for. Now you might of course then ask, why is that the case? And I think it goes back to the importance of human capital. These are very high human capital folks that you're paying these increasingly high salaries. They are increasingly populating that rich upper 20% that I'm talking about. But on the other hand, if you don't stay in school, your chances of making that upper 20% are considerably diminished. So you're talking about a problem which is a part of the larger problem that we're talking about, which is fueled in large part by an increasing returns to skill and parts of the population which have therefore been left behind if they don't have the skills. So stay in school and pay the tuition bills and grit hard.
They're also seeing a growth in the size of the administration at most colleges and universities. So there's a lot of, arguably administrative bloat that is now increasing college tuition. And it's also the case, too, that the facilities that students enjoy on college campuses today are much nicer, both in terms of dorms and other facilities, athletic facilities, than was the case, 20, 30, 40 years ago, and those things are costly as well. So these other factors, too, are helping to drive the cost of college up higher probably than it should be.
We have one last question. And the reason why I'm picking this one is this same question in some form came from 6 different people. T. Piketty's book, Capital, drew a lot of attention because of its premise that inequality cannot be addressed unless the state intervenes. Does his research support his thesis? ? Have at it, gentlemen.
What's the question?
Is
reducing
government required to reduce inequality?
Well,
The
we
state
should separate
intervenes.
that. Does government policy affect inequality? Absolutely. Do you need more government intervention to reduce inequality? I would argue to the contrary. The point that I was making in my talk is We have to have greater encouragement for saving. We have to have greater encouragement for, for work. And we have to have greater encouragement for developing the skill with which we use those resources. None of those require greater government intervention. They require sensible government policies. That's all I'll say. I mean, we don't have time to go into flush out the details.
Footnotes, Brad, Bruce?
I guess I've argued that I think our tax system should be a little more progressive, and I don't argue for it to be progressive to reduce inequality per se, just because I think in some dimensions we probably need more revenue to balance the budget. And the ways that I would argue that we should do it would be ways where it's least burdensome. And I think some of those ways, state tax, raising rates a bit at the top, would tend to reduce inequality. But that wouldn't be my main goal in advocating those policies, rather that we need money to run government and we should get it from the place where it's least burdensome. And I think those are two good places.
Good enough. I would like to thank you, gentlemen, for your participation. Thank you, audience, for coming. Thank you for about the 200 questions I got from you.